Smash! Compilation.
Hey, today I got a compilation video for ya. With the year dying down, I need a little break from the channel overall with making newer content, so here I am recycling a bunch of my older stuff, so yeah, I'm basically doing a clip show. But hey, it's Christmas break, you have a bunch of time in your hands, you can listen to this in bed, you can listen to this in your car, you can zone out and watch this in your room with the lights off while you're supposed to be hanging out with your relatives. I don't really care, have fun. But hey, before we get into it, leave a like, comment, and subscribe, share with a friend, consider becoming a channel member, and let's get into the videos. Oh yeah, the theme of this one is chaos! So to start everything out, I did a little unboxing. I just kinda want to show you guys the exclusive sprue that comes with the set. Overall, I really like this kit. The modern chaos sculpts are really nice, but I do kinda miss the old sprue. A big part of this is the painting style that Heavy Metal used to use for painting chaos miniatures, but I have some more gripes that I'll talk in greater detail later on. For my kill team's overall feeling, I wanted to go for a squad filled with chaotic zeal. I began by attaching this head from the Kador gang set. The mask is very cult-like, and I like to imagine these dudes, despite being Chaos Marines, show humility to appease the dark gods. Despite their power armor and their gifts, they're still pretty low on the totem pole. To take this further, I pulled this Chaos Undivided banner from the previous generation Chaos Marine kit. I'd attach it using the standard bearer pole from the old Space Marine command squad, and I'd clip it to size. I cut it rather close, any further and this would be way too short. But overall, I think this looks really good. I couldn't ask for a better fit, and he looks incredibly over the top. I like mixing the cartoonier bits of old with the modern parts. I think they work really well together. Due to how closely I snipped it, the banner itself is kinda pushed forward, mostly off of the backpack. To me, this looks a little bit more realistic, as the cloth would naturally hang. Keep in mind, I'm no genius, I was not exactly going for this, it just kinda happened. Happy accident. Despite the New Age miniatures being very crisp in their design, I think these old bits really work well. So I always try to make sure I have at least a couple sprues left over from my older age models. Random sparks of imagination come and go, and it's good to be prepared for it. For the weird Anointed Marine, I felt the bits included for the set were a little tame.
Happy Halloween, ladies.
I don't dislike them, but for the role of some sort of Demon Marine, I feel like they kinda fall short. I began by using this claw from the Genestealer Acolytes cult set. I began by applying sprue goo over the entirety of the claw, mostly over the chitin and to kind of block out those weird Genestealery elements of the claw itself. This being specific markings, the weird little vents that all Genestealers have, anything to make it look more like a natural claw. I'm not too worried about this being lumpy. I feel like making it look fleshy and deformed kind of helps me during the painting phase. This process is a little tedious, but it's worth it. Also, I got a couple questions asking why my sprue goo is green. It's because I used a kit from the older Kill Team sets where they had colored sprues. I always thought that was weird. I'd also fused together that double-jointed arm, and after gluing it, I clipped a pauldron to size. I wanted to give the look that this arm just burst through the ceramite itself. Only issue I really ran into is that there's kind of an ugly gap. To rectify this, I'd peel down a little piece of sprue, and I'd use these little bits to kind of weld the gap between the arm and the body using cement glue. This takes a few go-overs, but at the end of the day I think it looks really cool. I'm kind of attempting to give the look that the armor and the flesh are somewhat fusing together. Also, yes, I do realize that I didn't give him a bolt pistol, but I don't know, use your imagination. I'm sure you could just squeeze it with his claw. I guess I kind of gave him 2 claws now that I really think about it, but whatever. He looks unique, he looks cool. He's my guy, not yours. Bleh. For the head, I used this old Plague Marine noggin, and I trimmed it directly in half to keep that gruesome mouth. I'd then do the same to this basic Chaos Marine helm, except this time I'm keeping the top. I'd then glue it together, and I created a truly fearsome and nasty looking Demon Marine. Once it's glued on, we're just going to fill in that little gap using some more cement glue, and then it looks perfect. I'm super happy with this figure. I'm really glad that I inadvertently created the look of exposed skull. Freaking brutal. I have some really cool ideas in mind for how I want to paint this guy. I'm really happy with how this turned out. Despite all the little cracks and crevices this guy has, it works to the advantage of the miniature himself. He's supposed to look nasty, he's supposed to look feral, and just utterly corrupted, so all of this just works in my favor. Moving on to my gunner, I continued the Khador gang parts. This pointed head with the candles is actually something I wanted to use on a Chaos Marine ages ago, hence the slight remnant of paint. I took the banner from the same kit, except I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to fit it on. It kinda worked hanging off to the side, but I felt it looked a little busy. So over time I kept trimming until I was left with just the very top. And it fit perfectly between the wings of the power pack. I'm also happy I kept the skull on the back. This kinda gives visual interest on both sides of the Mini. Also, not like it matters, but I decided to use a melta-gun instead of a plasma gun. I'm just a little tired of painting plasma, I guess. Not only did this fit perfectly between the 2 wings, once I added more cement glue, it fused together like one long piece. If you're familiar with my content, you'll probably know by this point I think I've milked every last bit I can out of the Khador gang parts that I can. I truly don't think I've built a single Khador gang member on its own. I think I've only ever used the bits for kitbashing. Like I mentioned previously, I don't dislike the anointed head, so I ended up using it for another Marine. I still think it works really well with the context of these Marines being heavily influenced by the ruinous powers. So using that and the bolt pistol arm, I ended up making a classic chainsword Marine. Maybe not a figure I'll run a ton on the tabletop due to the team being very specialist heavy, but he's still a cool figure to have on the roster. Plus, this pose makes him look really burly. It's like if you took Taz and put him in power armor. For my leader, I ended up using the weird sorcerer head, and I felt the markings and cocky expression were kinda perfect. I think it looks great on the Balefire Acolyte they designed for the box, but I have other ideas in mind for that mini. The Demon Blade and the head are kind of an obvious choice for a leader character. With the pose of the plasma gun, I think he looks really good. But to finish him off, I ended up using one of the icons from the base kit. This one in particular looks perfect. It really completes the mini all around. There's no second guessing what this guy is all about. Like I previously mentioned, I already had an idea in mind for the Balefire Acolyte. Nothing special, all I did was attach this old Slaanesh melon from the old Chaos Marine kit. I'm kinda going for a more Chaos Undivided kill team, but I think the Slaanesh Demon Head is more versatile in terms of their design. It kinda lends itself well being more ambiguously corrupted by Chaos. It really is just kind of a demon face with a horn. I kinda wish that the newer Chaos Marine kit had more bits dedicated to the 4 gods like the old one did. I know that each god kinda has their own Chaos Marine models now, besides Slaanesh, but I don't think anyone would complain if these kits had some extra bits giving the Marines a little bit more flavor for each god. Kind of a middle ground between being undivided to being somewhat favoring a particular deity. Also, I feel like I end up saying this every time I get a newer kit, but I wish the decal sheet had more options just like the old one had. I understand that the newer decal sheets are more dedicated to trimming down the factions in favor of giving more detail to each of the more popular ones, but it kinda sucks butt that the Crimson Slaughter doesn't have any more decals, and they don't have any generic Chaos Stars, or generalistic symbolism for each god. Okay, mini rant over. For the Chaos Marine Butcher, I ended up snipping this part from an old Chaos Marine Terminator. I was gonna put it on the Knifey Marine, but I feel like it fits much better on a crazy dude wielding a street lamp-sized chain axe. I feel like these ornaments are more befitting to a guy that would pull your intestines out and use them like gym ropes. I glued this rather haphazardly to his backpack on purpose. I kinda wanted to make it look like he just mounted this on as he went. These guys might be undivided, but this guy certainly has his preference. This next guy was going to be the leader, but I kind of scrapped the idea once I settled on the hyperzealous theme. I then decided to give this guy a bolt gun. Given his pose, I trimmed the hand off one of the original Dark Imperium Marines, kind of giving a chaos incarnation of him. This really saved the miniature, as I really didn't know what else to do with him once I demoted him from leader to simple bolt gun Marine. Oh, and his helmet came from the Raptors kit, which in my opinion is one of the most crisply designed and detailed products the GW's ever produced. I'm mostly saying this because this is kind of an older kit and it really holds up to modern standards. This basic knife hand worked perfectly for the overall pose, and all I really needed to do was clip the hand, clip the other hand, and glue it in place with my cement glue. One of my favorite parts about cement glue is that it really does cut down on the time I need to sand things down. That being said, the final two specialists in the kit I really didn't change up too much. I kinda dug their designs to begin with, so for both, a simple head swap was all that was needed. And the gunner just kinda got extra ammo. I don't think he exactly fits the theme of what I'm going for, but I think he looks fine on his own. The old school Skull Marine helmet works really well for the knife guy, and I feel like adding anything else would just detract. Overall, I think the effort that I put into each Marine paid off significantly. I am super happy with this squad, and I can't wait to paint them. Well, kind of. I can wait. I'm not exactly 100% sure how I'm going to paint them, but I'm like 67% of the way there, so... Regardless, it'll happen eventually. But hey, I think what we got done today was super fun, and I hope you feel the same. And I especially hope you found it helpful. If you did, why don't you give it a like, leave a comment, subscribe, and share this with a friend. Simple little clicks like that really help my channel grow. And it lets me know what you guys want to see. But I think I've flapped my beak enough. Until next time, I'll leave you with a mishmash kit bash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya. For my first model, I'll start by simply assembling the base body of the Terminator. No need to worry about the arms or any other pieces of the armor. I then begin snipping away at the chest of the Terminator. I know it looks a little aggressive, but I am being very diligent to keep the place for the head intact. I don't want to damage this by any means. I then dry fit on this chest piece from the 8-bound kit, making sure that each corner fits snugly to the core of the Terminator. Once I was content with its placement, I then began adding a little bit of Tamiya. This will look a little ugly at first, but we'll clean it up momentarily. While this is adhering, I want to keep pressure on the chest. Not too much, of course, as we don't want to have the piece spring back from tension. But we will want to keep it firmly in place as it properly melts along with the Terminator. I'll be adding in a little bit more cement on the sides of the head case as well. I want to adhere this gap between the plate and the base body. We don't have to worry too much as we will be adding in some sprue goo to fill in these gaps, but using just a little bit of Tamiya beforehand is usually a good idea. Also on the side of this 8-bound chest, I snipped away at this weird flesh tube to better adhere to the cables on the side of the Terminator. Like I mentioned previously, we're now moving on to our good old friend sprue goo. Here I'm just filling in some gaps, blatantly covering up any ugly remnants of the chipped away portions of the Terminator. I especially want to fill in the gaps between the headpiece and the chest, and I'd continually do little drive-bys with the sprue goo as I picked out the arms that I wanted to use for the Terminator. For this, I'm simply using this chain axe and storm bolter. This comes with the base kit, and I think it's perfect for a World Eater. I am completely unsure if there's any special rules for Terminators for World Eaters. I don't play the base game. But I think this works just fine. I just want to make some cool minis. And for our raging little lunatics melon, I decided to use one from the 8-bound kit as well. I wanted to use one that looks a little less corrupted. I don't want him to look like a demon. So I picked out one with a face mask. To get him to adhere better, I glued on a little piece of backing plastic from one of the Terminator helmets. The 8-bound heads are flat in the back, so they don't exactly adhere perfectly to the base kit. Because of this backing plastic, he'd fit nicely into place, and to smooth out the backing area, I'm using just a little bit of sprue goo and letting it pool to the back of the Terminator. I suggest letting the Mini lay flat on his back while this dries, just in case. Now we're just gluing on the Terminator's spikes and pauldrons. Initially I wanted to use some of the 8-bound pauldrons, but they don't exactly fit all too well, and I really do want to keep them intact for the actual 8-bound minis. I have great plans for those guys. But once the pauldrons and spikes are in place, I'll be doing one more go over using the sprue goo, as I want the chest piece to uniformly adhere to the model. I don't want it to just look like another piece that's added onto a figure. While this dries, I'll be sure to add some more pure Tamiya to keep things from being too goopy. And with that, we've got one Terminator down. And man, I'm really happy with this guy. I know the goo looks a little chunky here, but keep in mind it will nicely smooth out as it dries. But onto our next figure, it's time to give Wally a new body. This headpiece, of course, coming from the old Berserker kit. I'm sure the new one would be perfect for these guys, but I don't have it. And the old ones have a special place in my heart as they've aged horribly. Besides the heads, of course. Anyway, I'd start by snipping the bottom of this head, and it already looks pretty cool once it's attached to the model. Whoops. But I can't not use another 8-bound chest. This works too damn well for Terminators. Plus, I'm only building 3 Terminators, and the 8-bound kit comes with 8 chest pieces, so do the math. So once more, we're going to be trimming at the chest of the original Mini. I didn't go as brutal this time with the snipping, as I had already glued his head in place. Obviously, I don't want to go full buffoon and ruin Wally's mug. Again, this chest piece aligns rather well with the tubes on the Terminator body, but we'll have to add in some more additional padding to make it look a little bit more consistent. Because I was a little less rampant with the snipping this time around, there's more apparent remnants of the Terminator armor below, which I actually don't mind too much. I could honestly go either way with covering this up with sprue goo or just leaving it as is. I think both options are visually appealing. But on the right side of the armor, we actually have a cap for a tube on the 8-bound chest. And for this, I decided to roll up some green stuff. After I rolled it into a sort of a wormy looking tube, I'd push it into place and mold it, admittedly a little hastily. This will be relatively covered up by the hulking arms of the Terminator, so I'm not too worried. But I wish I gave this a little bit more love, and I wish it looked a little bit more mechanical, as this kind of feels like it'd be better placed on a Death Guard miniature. I'd also add in a little bit of green stuff to the cables on the left side. And once it was in place, I'd quickly carve it with my knife to form a similar shape to the cables. Again, this will be pretty obscured overall, so I'm not super worried about making it look spectacular. For his main weapon, I decided to give him this chain fist. You can't tell me this isn't perfect for Wally. Okay, given the Wally meme, maybe a chain axe would have been better, but we already have one in the squad, so whatever. I then added on these more regaling pauldrons, as I found the iconography and the chainmail to be a perfect fit for a World Eater. Once his armor was adhered, I'd go over with a little bit more pure Tamiya, sealing up any cracks as well as adhering the green stuff a little bit better as it was close to drying. And with that, man, this guy is one of my favorite minis I've ever built for the channel. Really not much we had to do, and he looks like an absolute monster. I am really excited to paint this guy. I love these 8-bound chests not only because of the symbols that they have for World Eaters, but I love just how burly these guys are. They're like if Plague Marines ate nothing but protein. But we've got one more miniature to make. And for our last guy, I'm essentially doing the same tricks as I did previously, and I thought about keeping the chest intact, but you know the drill at this point. Once he was all carved up, this chest plate actually ended up being the best fit of the trio. I still used some sprue goo to keep it in place, but just about everything fit without a hitch. I did end up filling in the little ugly spots below, but I really started to get a good feel of how to quickly and efficiently build these guys. Keep in mind, I'm by no means an army builder, and I'm unsure if Terminators are actually really used too often for World Eaters at this point, but I was kinda shocked to see the lack of an upgrade sprue of sorts for how integral Terminators were to the World Eaters. Regardless, let's get back to the Mini. For his head, I ended up doing the same trick as I did for the first figure by using a back of a Terminator helmet, but this time I glued on the backing plastic in first, and then I adhered the head on by using a little bit of sprue goo. It's kinda silly, I actually ended up using this method in the last video that I did. Worked well, I'm not sure why I didn't do it for the first Mini, but we live and learn, I guess. Sort of. I don't really learn. Because of this, I didn't have to risk putting any sprue goo into the back of the head hole. While it dried, I'd poke the head around using my knife to find a pose that I liked. And then I'd add on all the weapons and extra bits of the armor. Again, I'm going simple. A power axe works perfectly for a World Eater. And with that, I've got 3 brutal-looking Terminators. I know the Terminator kit comes with 5 miniatures, but I feel like you can take these tricks and make your own amazing squad. And I just wanted 2 extra around for additional kitbash videos for other warbands. But I'm not done with these guys just yet, because you'll be seeing them again in an upcoming painting tutorial. But I think I've flat my beacon enough for one video. If you liked what you saw, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more. It really helps. And if you really liked what you saw, consider becoming a channel member. You'll get some extra mishmash goodies, some extra videos, and you'll get to see stuff early. But most importantly, remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya. So to start us out, I began with the legs of a Cataphractii Terminator. I was going to jump on the bandwagon of using Death Guard Marines for the main armor, but I felt the Cataphractii legs and the torso I ended up picking out were a little bit easier to convert. Didn't have all those plague bits that I need to cover up. However, this is something that I do want to do later on, as this looks sick. Anyway, this might be a little hard to watch with how haphazardly I did this, but I snipped away at the core of the legs. The upper torso I intend to use is a little too small to fit, and I don't want him to be too tall. Said upper torso is an old Khorne Berserker body. I felt the chains and studs were perfect. It's a little small, but I think this gives him a more true scale look. I did start sanding down the Khornite icon, but I ultimately decided to snip the lower torso away. This allowed me to glue this more snugly to the legs. But before doing so, I decided to use this Thousand Suns Sorcerer arm, and I'd attach a basic bitch pauldron to it. This totally wasn't a bit that I had glued onto an older Mini, and the remnant of paint is just your imagination. After getting the arm glued to the torso, I would use some super glue to adhere the torso to the legs. This looks very ugly now, but don't you worry none. We'll be fixing this up momentarily. Not really sure why I said it like that. Going back to the Cataphractii bits, I'd snipped down this leather loincloth piece, and I have 2 uses for this. First, we'd wedge a piece of this into the torso and the legs. This is kind of acting as a weld with my Tamiya cement. Again, looks super uggo, but we're all painters here, we gotta trust the process. All that matters is these 3 torso coils are present. We then use the metal plate of the loincloth and apply it in its proper place. I'm not using the leather for obvious reasons. We'll actually end up using a second plate to cover up that ugly spot, after sanding it down good and properly. I think this makes him look really burly, and it's totally not acting as a rug to hide the mess beneath. At first I thought this kinda looked ugly having 2 identical belt buckle pieces on the same torso, but I think it looks really interesting after painting. Also, I'm sure you've noticed that I used a different pair of Cataphractii legs. This was purely because I wanted a more dynamic pose. I'll use those other legs for something else cool. Getting it to fit in place is relatively easy if you use Tamiya cement. As you can see, I kind of fussed with it just to make sure it stayed in place properly. Using thinner glue or Tamiya cement really allows you to fiddle with things and push them into place to your liking before they officially dry. And also, I'm making sure to sand down his feet so he applies to the base nicely. The leg change and the cork really makes him stand out. He looks like a true hero character now. So for his axe, I initially used the power axe from the basic Chaos Marine kit, and this could work pretty well on its own. I ultimately decided, however, that I wanted to use this axe head from the Gellerpox Infected kit. We'd snip down the original blade, and I'd cut the head off of the other axe freely. I'd then shave away using my X-Acto knife, albeit in a rather unwise method. Cutting away from yourself can be just as, if not more detrimental when trimming minis. Case in point, much less leverage. The Gellerpox axe had these little studs, and I used it as a guideline for trimming. Undeniably, this made it easier to snip, but I didn't exactly think about the placement. I then sanded it down and glued it on, and this looked a little wonky, so I decided to trim it down a little more and sand it down, glue it on, place it back on, and there we go. I'm happy with this. Part of me kinda wishes I just ended up using the original axe, but I like how this looks and I think it's unique. For his melon, I used this head from the Kill Team Legionary kit. And no, the bionic eye is on the correct side, you're just insane, I'm not gaslighting you, you're a maniac. I probably could have used any of the trillion bald Robo-Eye Marine heads, but I like this one in particular because he has Perturabo cables in his noggin. Rule cool, baby. After picking a pose I liked, I then glued on the axe. Looking pretty good so far. I then decided to use a little PVA glue and prep for the base, and I dunked him in some beach sand. Not super duper related, but I've had a lot of luck with this stuff. So here we are onto the most important part. I initially used this Flesh Golem mini from the Nulzer's line. In theory, this arm looks perfect, it actually looks identical to his main pose. This really was a journey as I was kinda scouring my entire hobby space for a bit that would do him service, and this is the closest thing I could find. But after snipping it off, wowie, not exactly proportional. But hey, I've been meaning to get this kit anyway. From the 8-bound kit, I used this absurdly detailed arm. We'll start by trimming away at the weapon and obscuring those fine details. First priority is snipping away and slicing off these weird vein tube things. His arm is supposed to be relatively crisp and shiny, and I did kind of fiddle with the idea of leaving these details on to make him a little bit more unique to me, but nah, I want to make him right. A bionic eye on the wrong side is one thing, getting his arm wrong is another. This kind of required a lot of work to get this right, as there's a lot of details that I really need to obscure to make it look correct to the actual character. After getting it to a place where I really liked it, I decided to glue it on. Obviously, I'm not done with this part, and there's huge portions that still need to be snipped, obscured, etc. However, I decided to wait for a little bit longer to clean up the arm, as I wanted to attach this pauldron from the Inquisitor Kill Team set. I'd sand down the iconography, of course, and I'd glue it in place, and I thought it looked really perfect. Also, yes, wink wink nudge nudge, I'm doing an Inquisitor Kill Team kit bash. This is one of those kit bash parts that really clicks. The 8-bound arm is rather flat on the deltoid, so attaching this was really seamless. As much as I love complicating my kit bashing by doing more convoluted methods, whenever pieces like this fit together, it's just super satisfying. Next, for his weird pointy knee spike thingies, I used the pommels of a couple Blood Angels power swords. Sorry for the shite camera work, but I think it's pretty easy to figure out what I'm doing here. These are a weird couple of bits to use for this, but I think it works really well. Coming back to the arm, I'd begin by slicing away at the tubes and these weird receptor things and sand them down. These pieces slice off relatively easy as they really jet out from the overall arm, But of course, I'm trying to be as careful as possible not to slice into the actual arm itself. I'm more than fine with obscuring a little bit of the detail of the overall muscle, as it'll look more akin to the actual character. But I want to remain cognizant of not slicing in too deep, as it'll be a pain in the ass to clean and fix. I then add in some sprue goo and apply a little bit of Tamiya glue just to make it flow easier into the details and obscure them. Also, I prefer sprue goo. Apparently it's sprue glue, I don't care. Sprue goo über alles. During this, I'd accidentally bump off the little pauldron, but it fits really snugly, so I had no sweat getting it back in place. For some reason, out of all the details on this miniature, this little pauldron I'm most proud of. So we're going back to his axe, and I decided to fill in these divots using sprue goo. This is a bit of a messy job, especially if you apply more over an already drying area. This can cause a really ugly spiderweb effect. And trust me, you're not gonna fix it. However, if done correctly, this is very effective. It's actually quite similar to painting. You don't want to push your brush over an already drying area. Also make sure to add a little bit of pure Tamiya over this just to make sure it dries nicely in place. While it dried, I used this little piece of chainmail from a Death Guard kit to act as kind of a loincloth. On the backside, I guess. Oh, and I forgot to mention this, but his backpack is simply an old Chaos Marine backpack. Good and simple, and the details seem more fitting to an Iron Warrior. I feel like the new Chaos Marine kits are not very good for applying to Iron Warriors. They're a little too chaosified. The chainmail glued pretty seamlessly to the back, and the pack itself obscures any ugly adherence. As a finishing detail, I'd come back to the axe, and I'd sand it down on the sides, making it buffed out to one solid part. I'm really happy with this, and after doing so, I'd call him finished. This miniature is incredibly fun to build, and I think he looks good as is right now, but after painting, he looks incredible, and I am really happy with this miniature. I think he looks really accurate to his actual depiction, and I feel as if I really created something that has my own unique flavor to it. And I kind of forgot how much of a blast it is to paint Iron Warriors. Expect the painting video up a little later on. While this guy doesn't have the same reverence as Varzival Cervantes has to me, I did end up reading on him a little bit more during the painting process. And let me just say, this guy seems like a really well-adjusted young man. Dude's on his grind, knows what he's on about. I like it, I respect it. But anyway, all jokes aside, I hope this video is not only entertaining to you, but helpful. If it was, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and share it with a friend. Maybe get a buddy that paints Iron Warriors that really likes this character. But I think I've flapped my beak enough as is, and I'll leave you with a mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna, I promise. See ya! Our first scheme is the Flawless Host. So for the lore heads, I know, technically these guys are not a successor of the Emperor's Children. In previous editions they were, but in their current state they are technically a Renegade chapter, formerly known as the Shining Blades. They also just happen to fall into the grasp of Slaanesh. But this kind of ties into why this video is a little bit difficult to pick out the color schemes. When it comes to Emperor's Children warbands, almost all of them have the exact same color scheme, or just no pictures at all. So these guys are the perfect candidates. And everybody I know that talks about these guys loves them. So to start actually kitbashing this guy, I took an old Chaos Marine body, and I just very viciously snipped away at the torso. I want to snip it very flat and sand it down very nicely and smoothly, as I don't want any jagged edges. Something I had to remind myself while using this kit is resin doesn't work with Tamiya. So I ended up having to use super glue, and I don't have the luxury of just melting the bits together. I really wanted to have a flat surface to adhere this body to. But thankfully, once it's sanded down, it's kind of a perfect fit. Admittedly, it's a little skinnier than most of the mainline torsos we have now, but personally I think this works really well for a Slaaneshi Marine. The more slim profile and silhouette kind of plays into their characteristics. For the Marines' weapons, I used a modern set of a bolt pistol and chainsword, just for simplicity's sake. But for the pauldrons, I ended up using an old Slaaneshi pauldron from the older Chaos Marine kit, which again, for the 15 millionth time, man, I miss that old kit. I really do like that they had just a little bit of flavor for each god. For his melon, I decided to use this very corrupted Raptor's helmet. I really like this one. The horns just kind of scream Slaanesh to me. I love the death mask. It's just kind of perfect for the guy that I'm going for. For the pauldron on the left side, I ended up just using a basic one from the same kit. I would have used a more modern one, but I felt like with the size of the Slaaneshi pauldron, it would have fit a little bit better. I wanted to use the power sword from the original resin kit, but I legitimately felt it was a little too grody to add onto any of these figures. And for the final piece, I ended up using the backpack. This looks a little nasty by today's standards, but once it was painted, I'm pretty happy with it. But with our guy all built, I think it's time we get into the painting. To base coat his armor, I used a 50-50 mix of dark ivory mixed with dark warm flesh and pro-acryl. Now, I want to use this as our main color scheme for most of the armor. The torso is much more of a fleshy texture, so I ended up using a different color for that, but we'll get into that momentarily. Now, you could be arguing that, hey, they already have a flesh-colored scheme, but I felt like deviating a little bit just to mix it up a little bit would look better. Once you've applied 2 thin coats, you can then base coat the bottom half using dark purple mixed with a little bit of dark plum. I wanted to add just a little bit of that reddish color from the plum just to make it look a little bit more in line with the art style of the old scheme. Sometimes these guys are depicted with much more of a cooler purple, and kind of a cooler colored skin for that matter. I just prefer more of a warmer style to these Marines. If you wanted to base coat it using just dark purple, you could go for that as well. Now when it comes to painting the flames, I kind of suck at this, admittedly. As you can see, I'm kind of sketching my flames in, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if you mess up. Thankfully, the dark ivory and dark warm flesh mix is really good at covering over these spots, so if you need to just go back in and redo it, that's totally fine. Don't be afraid to do that. To paint his flesh, I'd start out by mixing a little bit of dark warm flesh with some magenta. I usually just take a little glob of magenta and then glide over my dark warm flesh, and this really makes it easy to just create some interesting skin tones. A little bit more red works better for Emperor's Children and demon-like characters, so just up the ratio to whatever you please. You're essentially just kind of creating a flowing base coat for this. While cleaning up with the dark warm flesh mixture, I would add this also into some of the areas that I neglected to paint earlier, mainly portions of the Slaaneshi pauldron, and I would also add kind of a thin extra coat to the main areas just to strengthen the color. I'll also be using the same color to add onto the horns of the face. I'm just painting this onto the raised surfaces, the cheekbones, all that. Next, we'll begin highlighting the purple using a mixture of our plum and dark purple with a little bit of white, just the tiniest bit. This allows us to basically use the exact same color, just a little bit lighter. Which, yeah, kind of obvious, I don't know why I explained it like that. But as you can see, I want to be very careful adding this on. I typically like to do my little scritchy scratchies, but I feel like doing this a little bit cleaner on the purple makes it look a little bit better. After all, their entire gimmick is that they like being perfect. Though if you wish to add in the scratches, I'm sure it would look cool regardless. Next, we'll be shading the purple using a very concentrated shade into the recesses using a little bit of Druchii Violet. Now you're probably wondering why I highlighted first and then did a little bit of shading. I find that it's easier to shade when you have more of a definite area that is highlighted. It's kind of like coloring within the lines for me. I want a Warhammer coloring book. Next, to shade the skin-like portions of the power armor, I'd use Carroburg Crimson mixed heavily with Lamian Medium. I am definitely curious to try this with several different glazes of different flesh tones and whatnot, but I feel like this is the best method. Just make sure it doesn't overpool, it'll look really weird if it does, and if you need to add just a little bit more, don't be afraid to. Just always remember the toothpaste analogy. A lot easier to squeeze it out than it is to put it back in. Next, for his loincloth, I didn't get to film this as much as I wish to. You can kind of do whatever you please and it'll look good, but for this, I ended up mixing a little bit of burnt umber and warm brown, and then I just highlight over using a little bit of warm flesh. It creates kind of a natural skin tone-esque loincloth. Personally, I feel like you could do just about anything and it would look really good, but that's what I did for this. Now that our skin tone is finished drying from the wash, we can now add in a little bit of a highlight. This time, however, I'm doing it the more traditional route as I use the shade first. For this, I'm using a little bit of pallid witch flesh. Coming back to the purple, I decided to add in a final highlight using a little bit more white to the ratio of the purple and plum. I'm being a little bit overkill with this. I probably didn't need to do this. I just really like making the purple stand out. If you wish to, and it probably would have looked better if I was a little bit more selective with it, just do this on the tips of the armor, just to add a little bit of a glint. Next for our metallics, mainly the more decorative elements, I'm using some bronze from Pro-Acryl. Hey, I actually remembered it this time. Oh wait, you probably want me to say it again. Bronze. Anyway, I'm just using this on the more decorative elements of the miniature, the little screaming, howling, whatever these are, as well as the more decorative elements of the bolt pistol and the chainsword. Also, I might as well cover it, but I'm also using dark silver on all the more mechanical bits of the miniature. I do this for all the little coils and bits and bobs on every marine I paint. I probably don't even have to add it in, but I might as well just for completionist's sake. Also, just to further the purple a little bit more, I ended up using a little glaze of the darker purple, mainly the dark purple from Pro-Acryl, just to add into some of the raised surfaces that are a little too shaded. This is a good way of just kind of cleaning it up if it's a little too dark for your taste. I'm mainly only applying this to the power pack, just on some of the areas that I think the light would catch it a little bit more. Next, to shade all the metallic bits, I'm using some good old Agrax Earthshade. If you're worried about the silver looking a little dirty from the Agrax, you could use a little Nolan oil. I just feel like using Agrax over everything is faster and easier. So this next portion is actually kind of weird. I painted this Slaaneshi token on his pauldron using a little mixture of white with some Leviathan purple and Celestium blue. I feel like it gives this really strange effect, like it doesn't look like it really belongs in this universe. And I'd up the ratio of white to these colors for the highlights. I feel like it just kind of gives this weird salt-like rock appeal to it. I just wanted it to generate some weird visual interest. I feel like it kind of plays into the characteristics of Emperor's Children. It doesn't look like it really belongs. It's just kind of weird, and it stands out and it makes you uncomfortable by looking at it. In a good way, hopefully. Hopefully you don't just think it looks ugly. To shade in the symbol, I'd use some contrast medium mixing Celestium blue and Leviathan purple, just so I could put it right into the symbol. For the bronze elements, I'd highlight them using light bronze. And this is pretty self-explanatory. Just make sure to go over all the raised surfaces, and try your best not to paint this into the recesses. For all the silver metallics, I'm using, well, metallic silver from Vallejo Game Color. I just want to highlight the raised surfaces, create some more visual interest. I like the shininess, and it works well for this character. Now, it's not often that I talk about painting bolt pistols or bolt guns. I kind of have my own method for it, but I have to showcase it here because I forgot to show the portion where I painted the straps on the pauldron. I'm using the exact same method. I'm just mixing a little dark gray with ghost gray from Vallejo Game Color, and I'm just painting it onto the raised surfaces, and then I'm going over using a little bit of Black Templar contrast. Coming back to the figure's melon, I decided to do a recess shade using a little bit of Reichland flesh shade. I want this to settle nicely into the recesses. I don't want it to stain too much. I just want it to tan it more so it's more flesh-like. The redness will still remain, but I feel like tying this together as kind of a pseudo-glaze makes it work really well. I then begin re-highlighting using a little bit of dark flesh mixed with some dark ivory. I want to focus this more so on the horns and kind of the crest of the face, just on the sharper details to insinuate that kind of sharp, bone-like structure. Similarly to how knuckles turn white when you squeeze them. I really want to insinuate that the bone structure within this guy's face is really pulling at his flesh. But with that, we are now left with an amazing looking Chaos Marine. I really like this figure. I'm super proud of how it looks. I love the warband overall. I think there's a million ways that you can paint Flawless Host and they'd look amazing, but overall I think this might be my favorite way. I'm pretty happy with the flames. I think they turned out a little bit better than I was expecting. I definitely want to play around with it more so in other Chaos Marines. Maybe I wouldn't paint them as Flawless Host, maybe use a similar flame design because there's plenty of other Chaos Marine warbands that utilize that. But I've been meaning to paint these guys for a very long time, and it's cool that I got to share it with you guys. But moving on, our next warband is the Kohars Nasake. These guys are a relatively small warband, but they're run by Lucius the Eternal. Everyone's favorite I win, you lose, overpowered X-Pac go away heat heal that we all love and enjoy. Yeah, we love them a lot, don't we? Okay, you're probably wondering why I'm painting these guys. Well, this scheme is just kind of something I came off the cuff with. It was pretty much entirely improvised. And then I quickly realized after I finished the miniature that, oh wait, I didn't pick out a warband. Does this resemble anything? And these guys are the closest thing to it, so happy birthday. To start this figure, I'm using an M6 Corvus Marine. This is where most of the kit bashing plays into. I basically used a toothpick and the old Slanesh icon from the old Chaos Marine kit, and I glued it to the top of this Corvus backpack. It's a little messy because I'm using a toothpick, and admittedly I probably should have used something a little bit stronger just in case I dropped this guy. But the toothpick ended up being the exact perfect diameter to fit into the Chaos Marine icon, so I just kind of left it as is. Once I was happy with the placement, I began gluing on the little Noise Marine cannon, as well as the arm. This is where things got a little funky. The shape of the Corvus torso is a little bit different from the typical Chaos Space Marine one, and there's kind of this weird gap between the pauldron and the torso, but it's not entirely noticeable. It's really only noticeable when I blurt it out loud like this. But overall, I find it to be a pretty damn good fit. For his pauldron, I ended up using one from the Raptor set. The Raptor set has a lot of pauldrons with a lot of little speaker-esque designs built into them, so I strongly suggest utilizing that kit when making Emperor's Children figures. Next, for his melon, I decided to use this weird gimp mask from the resin kit. I wasn't quite sure what was supposed to be on his mouth. I actually thought this was excess resin. Apparently it isn't, this is just how it's supposed to look. So I snipped it off and I quickly realized that I kinda messed up major. To alleviate this, I did something a little devious, and I'm really hoping I don't get in trouble for this one. I ended up slicing off a stud from a Corvus pattern pauldron, and yeah, I glued it on, and it's a cool little decorative bead for his mouth, so he doesn't talk. This was kind of difficult to glue on. I ended up using an X-Acto knife to kind of push it into place. And, yeah, this is kind of a weird one. This is definitely kind of a weird conversion. I was kind of inspired by Unreal Tournament 2004. A lot of the more creepy designed characters really kind of utilize this kind of art style, and I feel like it fits perfectly with Emperor's Children. That, and for all of you that recognize that I use a lot of Killer 7 music in my videos, I'm gonna make you pog your brains out and just say, oh, it looks like Awazaru. But with that one final detail, I think this guy's ready for painting. To start him out, I began by base coating the entirety of the model after a Zenithal Prime using dark silver. I want to be careful when applying this. I don't want to put this over any of the fleshy areas, nowhere near the face, all that. Also, I don't show it for a while, but I do end up painting the gun using this color. I was a little indecisive, so if you wish to, paint the gun using the dark silver as well. Once the dark silver dried, I dry brush over streakily using a little bit of Vallejo Game Color Silver Metallic. I really want to create these really deep scratches in the armor. I really want to go hog wild with this, and if you wish to, you can use a detail brush to paint in more direct highlights. I ended up doing this mostly on kind of the sharper details like the knees, a little bit on the torso, not too much, not too little. Once that was dry, I'd paint over the entirety of the armor using Leviathan Purple. This is where things get interesting. Once you've coated over the armor, I then dry brush again using a mixture of the silver metallic mixed with the Leviathan Purple. Again, I want to create these scratchy highlights. I think it just looks really good on this model. The purple really stands out as a result, and it's just kind of a fun way of doing it. A lot of people utilize airbrushes when it comes to painting on more colored metallics, but this is just so easy to do and it looks amazing. Just make sure it doesn't pool too much. Next, for all the more decorative elements of metallics on the miniature, I'd end up painting them using a little bit of copper from Pro Acryl. I quite like this color. I haven't used it yet, and I'm kind of a big fan of it. Definitely apply 2 thin coats when using this paint. It's not opaque enough for 1 coat. Again, just be careful not to hit any of the fleshy bits on the miniature. It won't be as big a deal as the copper is a much more thin color as compared to the dark silver, but it's just something to look out for. Next, to paint all of the fleshy bits, I'm beginning with some dark warm flesh. I'll be painting this on all the tubes, the gloves, the face, and the little leather strip on the icon. I know traditionally Slaaneshi-type Marines have a much more pale complexion. I just wanted to see how a much more traditional tan color would look. You want to be careful applying this over the old resin bits. It's not the end of the world if you mess up and spill over onto the more metallic elements, they're very easy to clean up. It's just nice to not have to worry about cleaning up too much. But again, not the end of the world if you have to. Plus, with the Zenithal Prime, it just glides over, it's so easy to apply, and it's so much fun. We'll then be applying a shade of a little bit of flesh tone from Army Painter mixed with a little bit of red tone. I'm using a very, very tiny bit of red tone, and this mix is primarily being painted onto the flesh that isn't his own. So basically everything besides the little small window we have of his face. For that, you're just using straight up flesh tone. While it's drying, I can add in little highlights using the same flesh tone color, just to kind of re-establish some areas that are a little bit smudged. This portion was a little hard to film. The contrast between the dark purple and the flesh tones made it hard for the camera to capture everything, so it looks a little wonky. But here, I'm just highlighting using a little bit of white tone mixed with the dark flesh, just on the more raised surfaces. If you want to as well, I decided to shade in some of the areas that I felt weren't shaded enough using pure Bugman's Glow. Kind of a cool little trick to do that with. Bugman's Glow is pretty much just a better version of Reikland Flesh Shade in its own right, and you have more control over it, depending on the situation, of course. As you can see here, I'm upping the ratio of dark warm flesh to white just to mix in some more brighter highlights, mainly on the knuckles and the sharper details of the miniature. Next, to shade the flesh tabard on the little icon, I'm using Carroburg Crimson. This is not really thinned down, it's using just a little bit of Lamian Medium, but I want this to look more fresh. Also, if you wish to, you can splash this around on some of the other flesh tones in the miniature, mostly just some little gaps and tubes, just to add in a little visual flair and interest. Moving back to his face, I decided to paint the mask using a little Vallejo model color black gloss. Reason I'm using the gloss is I feel like it adds a very latexy finish to it, and even if you blend this color with other colors, it gives that same glossy effect. We want to be really careful when applying this. I do not want to stain any of the flesh using this color, and if you do, it's not the end of the world, but again, I'd rather just finish it in one go. Next, to paint his eyeball, I'm using a little ghost gray. I don't know if this is supposed to be an eyeball. I think it's supposed to be like a mark over the eye, or maybe some sort of servo eye, but I thought it would look really gnarly if it was like popping out of his skull. We'll also be using the same color to paint in the other eye. Just be very diligent to let it settle into the recess. We'll then highlight the mask using a little dark gray from Vallejo model color mixed with the glossy black. Mixing it together retains the glossiness, and it creates a very effective midtone. After doing so, we'll then move on to shading the miniature, and for this I'm just using Nuln Oil. I'll be applying this over the entirety of the metallics, all over the gun, and anything that isn't resembling flesh. While that dries, we can apply some Carroburg Crimson onto the flesh of the face, and over the eyeball. I'd also incorporate this into some of the other fleshy elements on the miniature. I would just try to be a little bit more sparing with it. I don't want it to be too uniform with the flesh on his face. I feel like it would just look a little bit weird and a little flat. And while that dries, I'd use a little bit of glossy black on the studs of the little flesh tabard. I wasn't sure how I wanted to paint the power cables. At first I was just going to make them black cords, but then I decided to use a little bit of white as I wanted to add in some contrast colors. But before doing that, I'd paint the eyeball and the pupil of the other eye using a little bit of burnt red mixed with black. I then also decided to use a little bit of bold titanium white to paint on some eye shine on the main eyeball. I probably didn't need to do this. I ended up cleaning this up a little bit later on as I felt like it was a little too shiny looking, and I would just use a little bit of gloss varnish to make the shiny effect naturally, but it certainly serves as some good practice. I'd also end up using this color to paint his cool little mouthpiece. We just want to base coat it, and then we'll add in some good contrast colors later on. I'd also apply a nice thin line at the bottom of the tube. It just kind of gives it a natural sharp highlight. And to paint the tubes, I'd use a little bit of Tesseract Glow. I know a lot of people have some gripes with that paint, and I understand why, but I think it looks really good here. The purple and the green just work so well together. Next, to paint his cool mouthguard, I'm using just a little bit of Magmadroth Flame. With the trifecta of the bright green, orange, and the purple, he kinda looks like a weird Halloween decoration. I probably shouldn't have said that out loud. I feel like a lot of people are gonna fail to unsee that. Next, to paint those studs in, I'm using a little bit more silver metallic, and we'd end up dry brushing over the entirety of the metallics using the same color. I might be a little lazy with this. I kinda ended up highlighting the copper using the same color. It looks a little flat, but I think it works for the most part. I then decided to go back in on the flesh tabard, and I'm painting it in using a little bit of blood for the blood god thinned down significantly. Next, to paint in his cool mouthguard tangerine, I'm using a little bit of solar flare from Two Thin Coats. And as a final dotting highlight, I'd use a little bit of dark sun yellow. And as one final detail, I decided to paint the leather on the hood using a little bit of Thunderhawk blue on the sharpest edges. And with that, our whatever chapter this is complete. I had a lot of ideas for this miniature. I almost painted this guy as pure gunmetal, but I feel like the purple looks amazing. I'm super happy with this model overall. I feel like all the elements can be very easily applicable to any kind of Emperor's Children or Slaaneshi warband if you wish. As risque and gross as it is, I'm pretty proud of the conversion I made on the face. I'm really hoping I don't get in trouble for that, but shh, don't tell. But moving on to our final miniature, I was originally going to be painting Angels of Ecstasy, and then I quickly forgot that they don't have gold trim, they have black trim. And the pink I painted is a little bit darker than this bright pink that they have displayed in the one piece of imagery that we have of them. But fret not, I'm going to be painting these guys next week, so stay tuned for that. This miniature is kind of an amalgamation of all sorts of Emperor's Children-esque color schemes, similarly to the last one, but it's definitely unique in its own right. And hell, if these guys resemble anything in the lore that I'm not aware of, I'd love to know. Comment down below. Unintentional rhyme. Anyway, to start kitbashing this guy, I'm using a generic Chaos Marine kit. This one is definitely the least converted. I ended up just using the same pieces from the original resin kit, and I think this one fits the best. Again, one problem I ran into is there's kind of an ugly gap between the main armor and the actual resin piece, and for this I ended up using sprue goo. It actually worked a little bit better than I thought it would, but at the end of the day, I feel like maybe using a little bit of plastic putty or some green stuff to fill it in would be better. And the other pauldron I'm using once again is from a Raptors kit. It just works so well for these guys. But the main reason I was so excited to paint this Marine in particular is the headpiece. This is some extreme body horror, and I am all for it. It looks so gnarly, so grimdark, and I really hope that they end up making more faces like this if they end up actually making more official Emperor's Children models. But with the wishful thinking, let's get to the painting. First and foremost, another Zenithal Prime, and for everything metallic, you guessed it, we're using some dark silver. If you want to skip ahead, I totally understand. For all the metallics on the trim, I ended up using more bronze, but this was more integral than the other pieces. I really wanted the bronze to stand out and be kind of a centerpiece of the figure itself. Part of me wanted to just paint this using bronze and white for a portion, but I ended up deciding that I wanted to add in some pink. For this, I used familiar pink from Army Painter, and I feel like this color just didn't work as well as I had hoped. Maybe my Zenithal Prime just wasn't bright enough for it to cling onto, but I really feel like it was just a little too thin. Maybe I didn't shake it enough, I don't know. So ultimately, I would still do this portion if you want to speed paint these guys, but I ended up actually painting over this color as it kind of gave me a good outline. Next, I'd paint in over the gloves using some Black Legion. I also painted over some of the tubes, but that's not as interesting visually, you can just use it wherever you please. Also, while the familiar pink was drying, I decided to go over all the bronzy areas and clean them up. The color is thin enough that I can just paint over it and it won't make any smudges. But for the next portion of the armor, this is where the paint actually ends up helping me a little bit. See, as much as I wasn't happy with the overall coverage, I felt that it settled really nicely into the recesses, so I decided that I wanted to paint over all the raised surfaces using a little bit of pink horror mixed with Emperor's Children. Again, if you don't want to do this, that's totally understandable. If you want to just use familiar pink and just go over twice, that's totally understandable. I know that I'm completely going overboard with painting this. It's a little superfluous, but that's just kind of how I paint. Overall, I don't think the coverage is terribly good on familiar pink, but I can't argue that it would make a really good shade. But for now, I really want to establish this bright pink color over all the raised surfaces. Just be sure to really diligently apply it, don't go into any of the recess details, it'll be a pain in the butt to clean up. Now, this is where I have to mention there's kind of an unfortunate thing that happened with this video. I ended up actually losing part of the footage. All it is one clip, and it's kind of an essential one, but it's pretty easy to follow just by verbiage. All I did was mix familiar pink 1-to-1 with some Lamian medium, and then I'd shade over the entirety of the pink areas. After doing so, as you can see, the pink is much more of a hot pink. Not sure why I said it like that was a little zesty. But I digress. Going back to the cables, I'm painting them using bold titanium white. I'm actually doing something very similar to the previous model, but I'm going to be going more in depth with the green. It's much more of a concentrated color rather than just Tesseract Glow. Tesseract Glow looks great in my opinion, but I really think this one takes the cake. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Next, I'll be shading all of the metal details using some black wash from Pro Acryl. I like to mix it up a little bit. If you wanted to use Nuln Oil, that's totally fine. I just had this closer to me. Like with most shades, this is where you can really start seeing this miniature come to life. Applying this to all the little areas and tubes, it just looks so good. Now you probably notice at this point I haven't colored the face at all, and I'm really just going to be relying on that Zenithal Prime. To add in a little bit of color, I'm just using a little bit of Carroburg Crimson. I want this face to look very pale and dead. Dude has a damn jukebox coming out of his face. Now coming back to our pink armor, I decided to highlight the entirety of it using a little bit of Emperor's Children. As you can see, I'm sketching this over all the panel lines. I'm being diligent, but I'm not sweating bullets while doing this. Just focus on some good brush control. If you spill a little bit, work it into the scheme. What I really like about this color is it really makes it stand out overall. It's kind of bold, and it does stand out a lot from the main pink color, and we can work some ways in to really blend it all together to make it look even more interesting. Old Emperor's Children box art has kind of a fleshy pink, and this is definitely more of a almost Barbie doll pink, but in some ways I think this looks even scarier. But as I alluded to with the blending, we're actually going to be taking some glaze medium from Vallejo and mixing it with the Emperor's Children. I'm just going to be dabbling this on the raised surfaces of the main armor. Don't use too much, we don't want this to settle into the recesses, it'll really make the armor look weird if you do so. You just want to carefully feather it in. Once I was done with that, I went back to the tubes and I used some Karandras green over the white. I really love this green color, especially over white. In fact, I loved it so much I actually ended up painting more of the tubes with this same color scheme. But coming back to the pink, I decided to feather in just a little bit of Carroburg Crimson mixed with Nuln Oil. As you can probably tell, this is very watered down. This is mostly just to tone down a little bit of the glaze I used earlier. I feel like I added a little too much in the shaded areas, and this just kind of helps tone it down. Coming back to the bronze metallics, I'd highlight them using some light bronze, just like we did with the first mini. I also decided to come back in on the pink and just re-establish some of the highlights. Some of it faded a little bit more than I was hoping to, and I just want to re-establish it so it really stands out. Coming back to the melon, I decided to paint on some of the cables using a little bit of Flesh Terror's red. You could use any color you like, it could look cool. Just adding in some neat cables like that is always interesting. Also coming back to the more silver metallic areas on the miniature, I'm using metallic silver from Vallejo Game Color to highlight it. Like I mentioned, the metallics are a little universal. Now coming back to that green glow on his power cables, I'd mix the Karandras green with some warm yellow from Pro Acryl. I kind of up the ratio as I go along the miniature. I want the yellow to be mainly focused on the sharpest details of the tube. And as you can kind of see, my hobby lamp gives us a direct line of where the sharpest highlights should be. We're basically using the green and yellow mixture together to trace over these lines. And if you need to, you could glaze a little bit of Cairnglass green to tie things back together, but something I really want to mention is this color looks a lot brighter while it's wet, and when it dries, it really dulls down. So just try to be patient with it. But as one final detail that I want to mention for the miniature, I decided to use a little bit more Carroburg Crimson, and I'd wash it into the facial structure of the Mini, around the tubes and into the eyes, just to create that kind of effect of very irritated flesh. What a wonderful final note for this miniature. And with that, we are complete, and this might be my favorite of the three. It really is ironic. This was my least favorite at first, and as time went on, I grew to really love this Mini. I think this color scheme is something I might attempt in the future again. I know I'm terrible about going on and on about how I want to make a kill team, but man, I kind of want to make a kill team out of this scheme. I'll probably want to refine some things. There's definitely parts of this miniature that I think need cleanup. But at the end of the day, I'm really happy with this. And I'm really happy with how the pink and the green stand out together. And yeah, I do feel kind of goofy because the main point of this video is I really did want to paint Angels of Ecstasy, but we'll just save that for part 2. And overall, I think I'm left with some really cool looking minis. I think Slaaneshi colors are really fun to paint with. Pink and purples are something I really don't use all too often. So it really is a treat to finally hunker down and paint some of these schemes. And I hope you found it enjoyable, and most importantly, I hope you found it helpful. If you did, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more, share it with a friend, and remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya. So first and foremost, I've always kind of been mesmerized by this chapter because, man, that is the most terrifying name for a Chaos Warband I can possibly think of. Ultra-violent names like Night Lords and Crimson Slaughter are pretty to the point. I think you can kind of guess what they get up to. Angels of Ecstasy? That just leaves incredibly scary hypotheticals in my mind. And that's kind of what their lore implies too. So, for the origins of the Angels of Ecstasy, they were originally a loyalist Space Marine chapter called the Sons of Luthunas. They'd end up rebelling against the Imperium during an event known as the Ganymedean Betrayal, and they'd go on to worship Lord of Grabass Slaanesh. Now, the only true piece of media that really dives into the Angels of Ecstasy is A Song for the Lost. This is where we meet our character Ulix. Growing up, Ulix was a choir boy for an Imperium ecclesiarchy. Routinely, he would be abused by his bishop, continually switched for not remembering the catechisms of the Imperium. His only form of comfort would be a fellow initiate known as Sister Defay. She would visit him every night, only being summoned by the prayer that she had taught him. Mistress of pain, master of pleasure, hear your child's cry. As you can probably guess, she is very, very loyal to her true god Emperor number 1. Years later, Ulix would become one of the Adeptus Astartes, even climbing to the rank of chapter master of the Sons of Luthunas. But surprise, surprise, he would soon become a Chaos Lord of the Angels of Ecstasy and a proper champion of Slaanesh. The Angels of Ecstasy were very much the type to use sonic weapons, but what sets Ulix apart is he was silent. To him, the only song that truly mattered was that of Sister Defay's. For centuries, her voice would echo in the back of his mind. Even through the indoctrination process of his initiation in the Adeptus Astartes, even through the clamoring noise of his warband, her voice would still remain. And to hear her song once more was the only thing he truly needed. And his obsession with this quest would fuel a lot of resentment from his underlings. Which really isn't surprising. It seems like almost every Slaaneshi warband is basically a bunch of Starscreams. But eventually, the quest would soon bring them back to his original basilica. Everyone that he had known prior was long dead. But of course that didn't stop Ulix and his buddies from nailing everybody else up on the wall like fish, and naturally he would go to find his original bishop and would defile his tomb. However, after doing so, his warband would be ambushed by a group of Eldari Rangers and Banshees. What also sets apart Ulix is he was a master swordsman. Despite his hulking size, he kept up with the finesse of the alien. However, his fellow battle brothers would not fare as well. One by one, they would either be cut down or shot down by the Eldari. Ulix would do his best to hold his own, though surely victory was in the hands of the Eldari. At least that's what the Banshees felt. They would unleash their sonic screams in a bid to snuff out the vile noise created by the Sons of Pleasure. However, this was their undoing. To literally anyone else in the galaxy, more than likely, this would leave them with popped-out ears and foaming mouths. But for the Angels of Ecstasy, this sound would act like f***ing Adderall. Their senses would heighten, they would shudder with pleasure, and they would act like it was a religious experience. Just before this, an Eldari Ranger had shoved his knife into the side of Ulix. But once he was revigorated by the shrieks of the Banshees, he would flick it out like a toothpick. Ulix would then go, and would stab the Ranger right through the gut. Warning you now, this is where things get really, really weird. Ulix and his brothers would board the Praise Eternal, the capital ship of the Angels of Ecstasy. The hulls and corridors of the ship would echo with the howls of Slaanesh. That and muffled screaming. And if that's not terrifying enough, it was basically a giant mirror maze with hallucinogenic fog and lesser demons just roaming around. Oh, and I forgot to mention, Ulix would board with the Eldari that he had stabbed. He was still alive, and he was blindfolded. I told you this was getting weird. Ulix and his men would lead him to the heart of the ship. However, at this point, Ulix and the Eldari were the only ones permitted to enter. At this point, Ulix was vulnerable. He'd parse through the velvety drapes adorning the chamber, and all the agonies that had plagued him for centuries would fade away. His sister Defay would arise. She would take him by the hand and lead him to his bedchambers, once again singing her sweet song while holding the head of the teary-eyed Chaos Lord. Now, I would tell you what happened to the Eldari, but I don't think I can. The book is like $3 on Amazon. But with that out of the way, now that you know a little bit about the character, let's build the model. So, like I stated previously, I'm using the Legion Praetor with the Power Axe, and the first thing I would do is I would clip away at the little tube at the side, and I would cut down a cape from the Deathwatch kit. To attach the cape to the model, I'm applying a little bit of Tamiya just under the little nub for the power pack. I'm kinda welding it on with the Tamiya itself, and I'm gonna be using a little bit of sprue goo to kinda weld it together a little bit more. This won't be super noticeable as the backpack will primarily take up all the space, so it's not really something I'm worried about. For the backpack, I decided to snip down the wings from my basic Chaos Marine. I wasn't sure how I wanted to apply this at first, but I knew that I wanted to use the Praetor's original backpack and kind of just chaosify it up. The little chaos skulls are just kind of perfect for this figure in my opinion. But for the actual Praetor backpack, I would snip the little ornamental piece on top. I think this is one of the things in the kitbash that I wasn't really happy with, as I didn't really do anything to replace this bit. But following that, I would also snip off the little orbules on the side. This is pretty easy on Corvus pattern. Now when it comes to the Chaos Wings, I really wasn't sure how I wanted to attach these. As you can see, I was kind of going traditional with kind of having them just stick out. But something about it didn't seem right to me, and truth be told, it's because I didn't size them up correctly and I kept snipping down and I wasn't happy with how they looked, etc, etc. Realistically, I think this would look cool on another Marine, but this is where I decided to kind of change things up. I decided to glue the little wings downwards. I'd have the chin of the skull kind of resting against the cables. In my opinion, the subtlety makes it look even cooler. And I really like how the little spikes on top symmetrically line up together. I actually have a lot of extra Corvus Marines lying around, so I think it would be really cool to use this same method on them as well to make them into Renegade Marines. Once I was happy with the placement of the little side nodules, I would glue it onto the base figure. Now you're probably thinking it would be wise to glue this on later, and you would be right. Truth be told, the reason this video has taken so long to get out is I haven't been wanting to paint this figure because I basically built them all at once. If you're new, don't do that to yourself. But moving on, for his weapons, I decided to use this huge sword arm from the Chaos Terminator's kit. Which is fitting, he actually has a demon-infused sword. At first I was worried that the arm would be a little too chunky for this model, but it actually ends up fitting pretty nicely. Now, this is where things kind of stray off from the original character. He doesn't really have a helmet in the book, but I had this last resin upgrade bit, so I might as well use it, right? However, I would snip off the top knot. I have something else I want to place on here. But before doing so, I want to sand things down a little bit and leave just a little bit of grit for superglue. And to replace the top knot, I'm using this decorative plume from the other Legion Praetor that comes with the main box. This being the Legion Praetor with the power sword. Also, I ended up using this figure for another kitbash. Check that out afterwards if you're curious. I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to place this on the figure, but I ended up settling on a front-facing design. To me, this looks far more intimidating and lifeless, and I really like how symmetrically it lines up between the cowl. When I first got the Finecast upgrade kit, I really thought this helmet looked grody and I really didn't know what to do with it, but I think that grodiness actually works really well for this figure. Now for his pauldrons, I decided to use one from the newer Chaos Terminators kit, and I would actually swap this out later on. I'm still using it, I just end up using it on the other arm. And speaking of his other arm, I ended up having to snip away at this conjoining tube, as it really did kind of interfere on the way that I wanted to pose this figure. Once I'd snipped away and sanded it down, I would use this Chaos Claw from the Cataphractii Terminator set. It looks weird now, but I have a very specific pose in mind. This is when I decided to use another Terminator pauldron, and this is from the original Chaos Terminator Lord kit. However, it didn't fit on the Cataphractii arm, so I ended up just swapping the two pauldrons with one another. But before doing that, as you can see, I'm placing my extra figure in line for the pose that I'm going for. I think you're kind of piecing things together. You saw a preview image, you already know what I'm doing. Right, like I said, replacing the pauldrons, I actually like how this looks better on top of it, so it just works out. Originally, I was just going to use two Chaos Terminator pauldrons from the newer kit, but the only ones that I had left had the little fur pattern at the bottom, and both of them were clearly designed for a right-facing arm. So I just felt like this one would work better. Now at this point, I decided to glue on those little decorative circular things that were on the base kit figure. I dabbed it with some glue in my X-Acto knife and whoa. Right, so I actually had to glue this onto the pauldron first and then attach the pauldron to the figure. Well, just for this one. The other one actually worked out pretty well, but it's funny. I'm not sure if I would keep these if I were to go back. I really like how they look, but I think it could be more interesting to have like a robe of sorts. It is what it is, I read the book late. But with that final element, I decided to call Ulix done. However, I'm not done kitbashing. To really drive the creepy Slaanesh vibes home, I decided to create a dark apostle for him to lean his giant power claw over. To start the figure out, I would snip away at this torso piece from the Blooded Kill Team kit, and I would fill out the back using some green stuff and glue it onto this pair of kneeling guardsman legs. This is from the old gun emplacement set. And for his left arm, I would actually use just a regular old guardsman arm from the same era. The head I ended up using from a Steel Helms kit, but I wasn't content with this face, it just didn't seem right. So I opted to swap it out using a bare head from the Blooded Kill Team kit as well. I found this stern-faced Baldy to be perfect. Her weapon, however, would come from the Steel Helms kit, just this classic claymore, and I decided to attach this pauldron from the Inquisitorial Kill Team. To me, this is what made the kitbash so fun. I think I pretty effectively created a lot of storytelling elements to the model with this addition. Having a figure whose life goal is to fight chaos fall to the god of pleasure, you can't tell me that's not interesting. But at the same time, remember, I didn't initially plan for this to be Ulix, but I think this works out. You could easily say this character is a more willing participant as a gift for Sister DeFay. Though I'd have to imagine Ulix would have to come up with some silver-tongued lies. Promises of power and pleasure, whatnot, you know, the usual. But moving more to the base, I decided to glue on this Iron Hands shield. I would probably remove this. For Angels of Ecstasy, this really doesn't make sense. For Emperor's Children, it totally does. But as far as I'm aware, there is no actual connection between the warbands. And being that they're Slaaneshi warbands, it's not like they do favors for one another. For the base itself, I kind of went simplistic. I just added a bunch of PVA glue and I dunked them in my mixed bowl of sand and rocks. Admittedly, I wasn't feeling too creative with the base up until I decided to add in a little green stuff. Again, this is more befitting to just generic Slaanesh Marines. I decided to make some really gross, gnarly tentacles, and it's not like Ulix has this power, but it just feels fitting for the base itself. This is definitely not my best work when it comes to green stuff, but I'm not looking to make a masterpiece. Tentacles are probably one of the easiest things you can make with green stuff, and that's why I'm using them. And just to have one wrap around the Inquisitor's leg makes it so frickin' creepy. But with that last little element, I had to wait for the green stuff to dry, and then I would get to the painting. I'm gonna warn you now, I was very experimental with this paint scheme. There were some things that I would totally do differently, but maybe you'll learn something. So to start the model, I Zenithal primed him and I sprayed him entirely using Weird Elixir from Army Painter War Paints. This is basically an equivalent to Emperor's Children, although it's a little bit more pale. I then decided to spray over top the miniature using some Doomfire Drab from Army Painter Fanatics as well. I already find this color more befitting of Angels of Ecstasy. They're definitely a much more pale pink as opposed to the classic Emperor's Children pink, and I think that's kinda where I fell short with this color scheme. Looking at him now, he is much closer to Angels of Ecstasy than what he turns out in the end result. The reason for this is I kind of experimented with Noosh. Now, if you're not familiar with Noosh, basically it's a medium made by ProAcryl to kind of emulate oil paints. I decided to mix it with Dark Magenta from ProAcryl, and this color just ended up making this figure look like a bright neon pink. Now, for any other Slaaneshi warband, I think this actually looks really cool, but for Angels of Ecstasy, they're just not that color, they're more of a pale pink. I do think once I wiped away the excess, it did end up looking a little bit better, but I think I would go for a different color, maybe more of a darker red color. I think maybe a better color to pick from or use the Noosh with would probably be the Dark Magenta mixed with a redder color. Maybe Mahogany. And at the end of the day, I'm really not too unhappy with the scheme. I think this is actually a really nice looking pink, especially when re-highlighting using the previous colors mixed together. It's just one of those things that I think I could have done a little bit better. Now, with the helmet, I decided to emulate the one reference image we have by painting it kind of a similar pale color. Now, I have no clue if their armor has the exact same color on the helmet, but with this, I just decided to paint it that pale color. And for this portion, I actually mixed the Noosh with Mahogany and a tiny bit of Dark Magenta, and I think this actually turned out a lot better. Honestly, using this mixture on the entirety of the armor probably would have been the best look. I also want to mention for the black trim, I ended up actually painting it using dark silver and going over it with Black Legion. I had only really highlighted up by dry brushing over using a mixture of dark silver with just a little bit of bright silver. I think it would look really cool painting it on using kind of a Deathwatch black, but I really like the metallic look better. And for those nasty tentacles I added to the base, I decided to make him look really slick and nasty. I ended up painting him using glossy black from Vallejo, and I kind of highlighted them up using darker grays to white. Ugh. Not entirely necessary, but I want the squeamish factor of this model to be prevalent. And as one final little detail I wanted to add to the model, I decided with the pose of the little Inquisitor Acolyte that I wanted to add this kind of nasty blood oath little thing going on here. I'd kind of add a slash along the hand and just a little bit of blood on the sword. I don't know if it's canonically fitting or anything like that, but it's really cool. And with that, our figure is complete, and man am I happy with him. Well, for the most part. There's definitely things I would go back on paint-wise, and there's probably some things I'd want to fix up in the build process, but I can't say I'm unhappy with the figure. I do think he came out pretty damn good. At the very least, I hope I inspired you with some of these ideas, and maybe you'll make something even cooler than this. But I think I've flapped my beak enough for one video. If you did find this helpful, or at the very least enjoyable, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, share it with a friend, and remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya. Alrighty, first and foremost, we're going to be doing Chaotic Titus. As you can see, my original Titus figure was stripped of paint and he actually kind of fell apart, hence why I wanted to do a kit bash. Now the first thing I want to do is actually remove the arms and slowly shave down all the little bits on the miniature that are very Imperial-esque, you know, purity seals, iconography. And with this chainsword arm, I'm going to be snipping it down right at the elbow. I want to make a clean cut for this as the forearm will be used later on, but we'll get to that when we get to it. I also want to sand things down to make sure I have a nice clean surface to glue on another piece. This other piece will be a Chaos Space Marine arm with a chainsword. And I'm going to be doing the exact same thing I did with the previous arm, snipping it right down at the elbow. After doing so, I used a little bit of Tamiya and I softly adhered it to the previous arm, and it fits rather nicely. There is admittedly a little bit of a gap between the two pieces, but this is easily alleviated using a tiny bit of sprue glue or just a little extra Tamiya. Overall, I really like how this fits together. The parts are actually pretty nice. They don't really feel like they're out of place in terms of size and proportion. Now after doing this, I would begin snipping down the loincloth on the miniature, and this was actually a little bit more of a messy project than I thought it was going to be. I really kind of had to take the pieces apart. Thankfully, I didn't glue him down when I initially built him, so this did make the operation a little bit easier. I will say though, I kind of wish I wasn't so violent with the snipping. It would have been nice to save the loincloth if I could, but that's, it's in the past, what can you do? I'd also do my best to snip and slice away at the belt buckle, and I would take my X-Acto knife and do a little bit more on the model itself. This, of course, I had to put a nice X through the middle of the Aquila, or the Ultramarines logo, rather. I was a little bit violent in doing this as well, but I think at the end of the day it looks pretty good. Though admittedly I kinda wanted to go full NWO or CM Punk and just spray paint over the logo itself. But hey, enough of the goofy wrestling nonsense. Once I was happy with the carvings, I would glue him back together, or at least piece him back together. I didn't want him to be so adhered I couldn't pull him apart again if I needed to move something around, and I'm kinda glad I did so, as this next part would have been a pain in the ass. Since I snipped away at his loincloth, I decided to replace it with this tabard of sorts from another Chaos Marine. I would very gently snip this one down and carve away at the edges to make sure it would be pretty much entirely intact. Which was kind of a good thing. I did need to snip away a little bit more at the tabard itself, as well as Titus's lower groin. Man, I feel really bad doing this. But it would be worth it, as I would also kind of dryly fit the piece together over and over to make sure it would adhere nicely and actually look like it's supposed to be there. It really did fit well at the end of the day, although there's a little bit of it that does look a little bit awkward towards the lower portion, but I'm still happy with it overall. There wasn't a lot I could do to really manipulate it unless I really wanted to go hog wild with green stuff. Considering the tabard is originally on a more static posed body, it does look a little bit weird on a lunging and action-packed pose, but I still think it looks good and it fit really nicely. Plus the little additions of extra grenades and the knife really does make it look more chaosy. I didn't really have to sacrifice any more detail, and I think it added a lot to the figure overall. But after doing so, I would kind of assemble the mini by gluing on his arm, and I would try to figure out what I wanted to do next. This would bring me to his backpack, and I actually forgot to film this part, but I cut off the little nodules. To replace them, I'm using an old Chaos Marine backpack. I could have used a more modern one, but something about these older ones really speaks to me, and I ended up using this one with the little side tubes. After snipping them freely and sanding them down, I'd add them onto Titus's original backpack. The reason I'm using the original one is I really do like keeping on the original Ultramar symbol, and I think it looks really cool and kind of badass that he's just desecrating his old armor. Considering this very different what-if version of Titus would never exist, I think going all out with the bad guy look is really cool. Though I will say when it came to actually gluing on these little bits, it was a little bit difficult, mostly because I didn't sand them down to the level I probably should have, but it still worked out pretty well. Being that the original Space Marine backpack had these little side things, they actually glued in pretty easily. It was more just a matter of actually getting them to look even. That was probably the biggest hindrance. But while I let the backpack dry and adhere, I would then go on to the other arm. And for this, I'm using the White Scars upgrade arm with the skulls. And I'm going to be doing the exact same thing I did with the first arm, snipping at the elbow and gluing on a Chaos Marine arm. I will say I kind of wish I did this one over again. I did leave a little bit more of a gap than I probably should have, and I tried to fix this using a little bit of sprue glue, but it ended up getting a little bit gloopy and gloppy, and I would actually cover this up using some pure green stuff later on, but we'll get to that later. Above everything else, I do like how this looks, and the pose is pretty nice. I think it does look pretty nasty and evil, having the little skull bits. I am almost a little disappointed that I don't have more of these, because I really like this bit. But at the end of the day, he still looks awesome, and he's a worthy miniature to have it. Now once his arm was assembled and glued on, I would actually glue on his backpack, and I would add on a bit that I was going to use later on in a video that I made ages ago. Well, not ages ago, this little Chaos Star was actually from a Nurgling that I used in one of the earlier kit bashes I did this year, this being the Demon Prince Nurgle guy. I figured the Chaos Star would be a great replacement from the Iron Halo that he had in the first game, and I'm pretty happy with how this fits. It was a little bit difficult budging it in between the two pieces of the Chaos backpack, but I'm still happy with how it looks overall. After fiddling with all the little pieces and making sure they stayed nicely in place, I would pick out a couple of pauldrons for him, and I admittedly got a little lazy. I just used a couple of Chaos Space Marine pauldrons, though I don't think I really needed to do anything super fancy. I didn't really feel like going out and making a Chaosy Ultramarine symbol. That just seems like way more work than I'm willing to do. Though maybe that's a good idea for some of you guys. I'm sure you could probably do better than I did. And after I applied it, I was pretty happy with how the figure was looking so far. I then decided to add on a little bit more to his belt, and I would do this by using some old Chaos Marine bits, this being this little skin tabard bolt pistol holster. It really fit nicely in conjunction with his belt and the original tabard that I glued on previously, and just using a little bit of Sprugu and Tamiya really sealed it all together. It was something I wasn't really expecting, and it was something that I really just kind of came up with off the cuff. I'm really happy to just have these old bits lying around. And for his melon, I was actually a little bit worried about this because I didn't want to use his original one, so I actually used one from the original Sternguard kit. Remember that one? The other one I actually used in my flesh painting tutorial. But once his head was nice and snug, I would actually take a little bit of time to just kind of clean up around the model. And I kind of used it as a little bit of time to brainstorm any other ideas. I then decided on one final detail to add onto the belt, this being a Space Marine skull from one of the Chaos Terminators set. In my mind, Leandros wouldn't keep his mouth shut, and now he has a permanent little seat on his belt. Which is very ironic because in this reality, he's technically right. But he still deserves it because he's bald and I hate him. Anyway, after doing so, I did decide to add one final little element to the miniature. This being some ratty green stuff tabarding. I would just kind of add this on to the underside of the miniature. It didn't really look terrible, it was mostly just to kind of like clean up the mini overall. And I used it as a little bit of a curtain for some of the uglier areas. Obviously, I don't think it really needed this, but it was something that I wanted to experiment with. And overall, if you don't like it, I don't blame you. But hey, it is what it is. And at the end of the day, I'm really happy with how this miniature turned out. I think there's a lot of different areas that you could go with for making a chaosified Titus. This model was actually kind of a challenge to create because it's really hard for me to imagine a chaosified Titus to begin with. Which I think a lot of us share the same sentiment. But I'm pretty happy with what I was left with. I think one of my biggest goals that I had subconsciously was to make this figure look very undivided chaos-wise, and I think I did a pretty good job of doing that. I'm still not entirely sure how I'm going to paint him, and I'm almost tempted to maybe put it off to one of you guys to pick out a color scheme, maybe do another poll of sorts. I don't know, you could just paint him as Ultramarines colors, but I'm not entirely sure how I would like that. But it is what it is. I'm still super duper happy with the figure overall, and I hope you liked it too. If you did, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, share it with a friend, and remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya. So to start him out, I had to let him sit in AK Interactive's paint stripper for a good while. His old base is fitted with a rather thick piece of cork, and I decided to keep it that way. He's an imposing model, and the extra height would really make him stand out in a proper army. Though I don't exactly have any plans to make a proper army, I'm not much of a gamer. I'd also diligently clean off the old mold lines I had neglected to remove when I initially painted him years back, and the stray remnants of paint would also be scraped. Ultimately, I'm not entirely worried about this, as it really won't affect the overall paint job. I mostly just want to get rid of the clumps that are blocking any finer details. Also, I make this argument plenty of times in the video, but he's a Nurgly miniature. Little bits and pieces of stray remnant paint actually add onto the texture in my opinion, but if you're a perfectionist, I don't blame you for removing it. Once he was stationary on the base, I began placing the most important piece of the kitbash in place. And it didn't fit at all. But this was expected. I'd planned on shaving this down to begin with, but the paint strip bath actually made it so the old glue was removed from the miniature. This allowed me to take apart the back piece from the main torso. This gave me the opportunity to dryly fit in the head, and of course it still didn't fit. This is a huge melon. I'd still be forced to snip down the fly face on the back as well as the underside. And it looks very rough with how I'm doing it, but I assure you this was calculated. The last thing I'd want to do is snip down any details on the eyes or the overall helmet. Once I did this, I was able to comfortably and very snugly place in the melon inside of the armor. I love how this looks already. This is actually technically a recreation of one of my older miniatures that I painted back in the day, so I already like how this looks. I then begin sealing up any displacements or gaps in the armor using some Tamiya. Even though I shaved down the melon, there still wasn't enough room for the back piece and the front piece to fully adhere together. But not the end of the world, we can seal this up easy peasy. I'd also begin shaving away at the cork on the base, as I wanted it to look a little bit more conjoined with the base rather than just this random slab. I'd also glue on some friends to the base as well, this being a swarm of flies from the Gellerpox infected kit, as well as a Nurgling from Mortarian's kit. I really do love how many spare Nurglings you get with the Death Guard line. As the two minis began adhering to the base, I'd actually super glue on more to the areas of the cork that had been shaved away as well as any bald spots on the base itself. I'd give a good showering of beach sand to the base, creating a very rough and jagged gravel texture. I really love using this stuff. Its sporadic texture really gives the impression of a ruined city. So despite my initial run of Tamiya, I'd go back in and use some more sprue goo to seal in any cracks on the model. All the little ugly gaps would be sealed up, and I'd actually add a little bit more to the base around the ribcage of the fly swarm. And I'd sprinkle some more sand in place. Reason I did this instead of PVA was just a little experiment to see if I could use it as a glue replacement. It kinda worked. I'd actually repeat this process later on, but I wouldn't add any gravelly texture afterwards. I'll elaborate a little bit more when it comes up. After a little while of working with the Mini, I decided that the balance looked a little bit off having this Nurgling with the Chaos Star right next to this huge meat grinder axe. So I snipped it. This piece is pretty neato, so I'm sure I'll use it for another kit bash down the line. To replace it, I used this skewered marine helm from the Chaos Terminators kit. This looks much better composition-wise, but it also allows me to paint more contrasting colors via the helmet itself. But after this, it's time for the more integral pieces of the kit bash. Beyond the fly head, of course. As we need some wings, and for this, I'm using Plague Drone wings. The sprue is actually something I got off of eBay for a good fraction of the original kit's price, which I actually encourage you to do if you want to do more kit bashes. No sense in buying a whole kit if you're only going to use a couple parts. To adhere the wings, I actually had to snip off portions of the original miniature, which admittedly kinda hurt, but I actually don't care for these spikes, so the pain quickly subsided. I trimmed down the wings at an angle, and I'd adhere them using a little bit of sprue goo. One thing that I had to keep in mind is that these pieces wouldn't magically stay in place just because I glued them on. I'd end up having to brace the miniature a good 15 minutes per wing in order to form a proper bond. Also, a little bit of sprue goo soon quickly turned into a lot of sprue goo. My original plan was to make it look as if these wings burst from the pauldrons, but adding more sprue goo made it look as if they were morphed into the pauldrons, which I actually liked a little bit better. Adding in a little bit more pure Tamiya as well really allows it to really conform to the miniature itself, so it ends up being more structurally sound and it looks cool. Once they were on, this looks really good. I'm really happy. It's disgustingly nurgly, but you know I couldn't just leave it at that. We then shaved down the shoulders of the cape, which this actually did hurt a little bit more. I really love this cape. But it's for a good reason. Adding on the bigger wings truly makes them look like a monstrous insectoid. Now the key to making the adhesion process look so gnarly was actually gluing on the wings in place with super glue, and then adhering our sprue goo. It creates this nasty, crusty texture, which I personally find perfect for the figure. If you don't like the texture, I'm sure you could do this in a far cleaner method, but come on, it's an Nurgle Mini. Gotta make them go full gross. Patience was key during this process. As much as I wanted to work on the Mini, fiddling with it wouldn't do me any favors. I think the position of the wings looks a little goofy in terms of whether or not this Mini could actually take flight, but who cares. Like always, it's really cool. He's a demon too. Our silly little laws of physics do not apply to him. Well, sort of. I still had to balance him so his bigger wings wouldn't fall over, but who cares? It's a mini. It's my world, it's my guy, you shut up. I found that the drone sprue also had some interesting bits within it after the wings were in place, especially this gross little melon. I cut it from its original weird bone thing that it was attached to, and I'd mount it on the axe. Maybe I'm too picky, but I felt like the axe actually looked a little bald without this in place. I feel like with all the bombastic bits added onto the miniature, just a little spike would make it look a little bit more symmetrical. I'd also feather in more sprue goo onto the back, and I'd take a little time cleaning up some of the mold lines I didn't clean up earlier. And with that, I am very, very happy with how this guy is looking. But once I showed it off to my friend, they noted that with all these mutations, he practically looked like a demon prince. So with that, we decided to add on a little bit more real estate to his base. The original Lord of Contagion uses a 50mm base for some reason, and apparently this is weird at the time. I don't know anything about the rules, I'll be honest. But a proper demon prince uses a 60mm base. I just end up gluing this onto the 60mm, as I don't really want to magnetize it because I don't really have any plans to run this guy. I just want more space to add on cool nergly bits to the base. And to add on said cool nergly stuff, I'd begin by adding on a moat of sorts using Proacryl's gravel texture. This would give me a nice blend of sorts, making the figure look crested upon a destroyed wasteland. While it dried, I sprinkled on more beach sand as I wanted to keep the texture uniform. I'd also begin wedging in spikes from the Chaos Terminator's kit as well as the Chaos Rhino sprue. I'd also glue in some old skulls onto the base, and I'd be sure to push them deep within the texture. The spikes worked well to add onto this wasteland setting. I just kinda had to be careful picking up the mini. Watch out for those pointy bits. I'd also bisect this poxwalker and very messily superglue his torso to the base. With him looking as if he's sinking into the base, I think you know where I'm going with this. I'd also add in another poxwalker melon into the mix, and I'd actually recycle the spike from the Lord of Contagion back onto the base. After doing so, I'd begin adding in an absolute flood of sprue goo to create a liquidy texture over the entirety of the base. I also angled some of the ooze to flow from the top part of the base down to the lower portions, creating these little streams of nastiness. Initially, my idea was to just add in these smaller pools of the pus, but I felt like doing an actual moat around the miniature would look even more visually striking. In hindsight, I could argue that I should have put on a little bit more than I did, as the pools themselves during the painting process ended up being bigger. I'd also add in just slight touches of superglue as I wanted to make more of that crusty look onto the base, more so on the top side. I'd also lazily string it onto the poxwalker, and this ended up looking kinda cool. It's not great by any means, I'd probably use a different form of glue if I wanted to create a stringier effect, but I like how this looks. I'd also add in this Plaguebearer arm from the drone kit as well, and I'd have him reaching in from the depths of the rotted pool. Things are now really coming together. The Plaguebearer hand also has this weird nergly tube of sorts, I'm not really sure what it is. Initially I planned on snipping it, but it looks really gross, so I kept it attached. Also, thing to note is that these little pools will eventually dry and sag down, so using more was actually something that I was willing to do, as it would just end up looking like the gravelly texture below if I didn't. And as a last little step, I took the time to shave down and sand the rim of the base to remove any little remnants of the goo that may have spilled off. I'd also take the time to remove any excess sand or lint from the base, and as you can see, I had already primed the main mini by this point. So once I was happy with the base, I'd prime it the same color. And I ultimately decided it's time for the painting. The painting process was quite long, as this is the biggest mini I've ever painted for the channel, but I think it was worth it. Also, as just a little incentive for channel members, the tutorial will actually be uploaded exclusively for you guys. If you're not a channel member, don't worry too much, as this won't be the last time I paint any nergly miniatures on the channel. I love Death Guard way too much. I really do love painting them, and they're by far one of the best factions for relaxed painting and new painters. They truly are an army in which you can really sit back, relax, do the fun weathering bits, not worry too much about the tedious methods. Fun fact, one of my first armies I ever painted was Death Guard. I really do have a soft spot for these guys. But once I was done, I was left with one of my favorite minis I've ever painted. I love this guy. From the moment I found my original miniature with the fly face, I knew that I had to make this figure. I'm almost half tempted to strip my other Death Guard minis from the Dark Imperium set. They're kind of amazing and I'd love to paint them on the channel. But if I'm honest, it all relies on how much you guys like this video. Like always, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you liked what you saw. Maybe share it with a friend that likes painting Death Guard. Every little bit helps. Seriously, please give me more incentive. I love painting Death Guard. Okay, getting a little ahead of myself. And I've certainly flapped my beak too much for one video. So until next time, remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya. So like I mentioned, we'll be building these guys using the Mark VI Corvus armor as a basis. The first thing I want to do is make sure that everything's prepped on the model, and I kinda did a pre-basing. Going generic with the basing, and I'm going generic with the designs. I thought about using some of the Mark III armor, some of the newer ones, but I think the Mark VI serves as a good basis. Plus I might literally have like 60-ish plus Marines of Corvus armor, so yeah, I gotta use some of them. But to start things out, I am actually using a bolt gun from the generic Chaos kit. I picked this one in particular because I really like the tactical look of it. The taped double mag seems to really fit the design I'm going for, and it fits the arms close to the chest. Seems to me that the new Chaos Marines, or I guess the modern Chaos Marines, are just a hair bit bigger than the Horus Heresy Marines. And as a result, their arms are just a little bit longer, so I wanted the bolt guns to be closer to the Marine's chest and they don't look as huge. Though I kinda went AWOL with this later on with the leader, so I don't know. Anyway, for his melon, I decided to use this head from the White Scars upgrade kit. He looks incredibly menacing and could look both like a loyalist and a traitor, so I thought it was perfect. And at this point, I decided to snip the muzzle off the bolt gun. After doing so, I would sand things down on the front end of the bolter just to make sure that everything was nice and clean, and I would replace the muzzle with this bit from the Poxwalker's kit. The barrel itself is a little slim, but it is around the size of a bolter round, and this nasty looking bayonet is just kind of perfect for a more scrapped together bolt gun. I also kind of considered that this does look like it would be perfect for a Nurgle Marine, but it also made me think, what if I painted this guy as one of the Purged? Might be kind of cool to paint each of these guys a different scheme. But moving on, I decided to add on this little cloth thing from the original Chaos Marines kit. Or I guess the previous one to the modern kit. I really like how this looks. It fits onto his abdomen almost perfectly. I did use a little bit of sprue goo to make sure it adhered a little bit better, but I don't think it was really necessary. And once it was fully adhered, I decided to add on some pauldrons in the form of the cleaner pauldrons from the Corvus set. I decided that it would be kind of fun to do some freehand on this guy once I was ready to paint him. Though again, I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to paint these guys, so we'll see how I go about this. But once I was happy with the pauldrons, I decided to add on a backpack, and I just used one from the Chaos kit. I think subconsciously, I just really like the little orbular incense orbs on the ends of the backpack, or the power pack, whatever you want to call it. And maybe, just maybe, I want to paint this guy as one of the Purged. Mentioned it previously? I think I kind of want to do that, but we'll see. Maybe I'll do a short on it. But as one final little bit, I decided to snip down this little leather tabard or loincloth from the same kit. And I kind of adhered it onto him very messily. I just used a bunch of sprue goo. And overall my idea was, if his gun was blocking the loincloth, I didn't really have to adhere it very cleanly. On tabletop you're not going to notice, and I'm not exactly going to shove my camera into his crotch. So, I don't know, I think it worked out pretty well. I like how it looks, it adds a nice little silhouette to him, and overall he's a really great figure. He's kind of that all-arounder that I'm looking for. He doesn't have an excess of chaos trim, and he still looks plenty chaosy. There is no mistaking him between a loyalist and a traitor. You'll also probably notice, I don't know why I did this, but I kind of sealed up the rotted holes on the bayonet. I think I wanted to make it look a little bit more clean, but I don't think it was entirely necessary. But hey, still happy with him, he's a good first figure, and let's move on to the next one. For our next figure I did something a little weird, and I guess the footage just was corrupted, which sucks butt. But basically what I did is I just ended up snipping off half of the Corvus torso and I replaced it with the torso from the Land Raider kit. I'm a huge fan of the Land Raider gunner. The armor is incredibly unique and I would like to see an entire kit of just this armor piece. It almost feels like a combination of both Mark V and Mark III at the same time. I don't know, it's a really weird armor piece. But to replace the melon, I ended up using one of the Primaris Reavers helmets, and I really wanted this one because it was all scarred up. It's incredibly fitting for a Chaos figure, there's no doubt about that. And for his weapons, I just ended up using this bolt gun from the Chaos kit. The belt-fed design is incredibly cool, and it feels like that good mix of tactical with chaotic. For his pauldrons, I ended up using one from the Corvus kit, and then the other came from the old Berserker kit, this big f***ass skull. It's a great design, it's not too much, and it leaves me with a good amount of chaos trim to work with, while also making him feel like he's a chaotic figure. After I attached the bolt gun, I decided to add on some more little extra bits of gear. I ended up using a couple of grenade swatches from the Reavers kit on one of his legs, and the other side I ended up using one of the ammo pouches from the Infiltrators kit. And to really tie things together, I ended up using one of the old backpacks from the predecessor kit. I love these backpacks so much, I'm so glad I have an excess of them. But once the backpack was fully adhered, I decided to add on one final bit in the form of a chainsword. This little chainsword bit comes from the old Mark III set, and I really like this. I've said this before in older videos, but I would really like to see more bits like this that didn't just come in one of the upgrade sprues. Adding extra bits in the form of sheaths, swords, chainswords, power weapons, whatever, it really does add a lot to a figure. Plus, it is nice to have the Mark III chainswords because they look so gnarly compared to regular chainswords, and it feels all the more fitting that it's on a Chaos figure. The double-sided chains and teeth, or whatever you want to call them, make it look all the more gnarly, and I think this figure is one of my favorites of the bunch. I really like how he looks brutal, he looks evil. And he's a shining example of exactly what I want to get out of all these kits, and the kit-bashing project altogether. I definitely was hesitant to sacrifice the bit of the gunner from the Land Raider, but with how unique he looks, I think it was worth it, and I'm really excited to paint him up. But with that, we can move on to the next figure. Our next guy is definitely the most generic out of the entire set, but I still think he looks cool. At this point, you know the routine, Mark VI Corvus armor with a regular bolt gun from the Chaos kit. And for his melon, I decided to go for the top knot. Already kinda looks like a Black Legion member, I know, but you'll see the vision as time goes on. I then decided to add on this nice little pouch from the Plague Monks kit. Undoubtedly an old kit, but I got it out of the box at my local game store for like $10, so it was a pretty good deal. Bunch of great little extra bits in that kit. But once I was happy with the placement, I then decided to add on the pauldrons, and for this, I decided to use some of the old pauldrons from the predecessor Chaos kit. I really like the trim on these. I did actually end up deciding to use like 3 different pauldrons before I came to a conclusion that I just wanted to use another Corvus pauldron. But it's extra footage, and, you know, it gives you more ideas for other kit bashes. That's my excuse for that. Next, I ended up adding on this little pouch from, oddly enough, the Tech Marine kit for some reason. I think I just had this bit laying around because I completely cannibalized the entirety of that figure, so might as well just use the bits. Also, yes, I did end up using that little skull pauldron from the previous figure on this guy initially, and then I decided, no, I don't want to do that. But as one final little detail, I decided to use this tattered loincloth from the same Chaos kit, the modern one. And I snipped it down to size, and I did exactly what I did with the previous figure. Just used a little bit of sprue goo, and it was good to go. Though unfortunately, I was kind of a Neanderthal, and I ended up blocking up some of the detail on the legs, so I ended up replacing it with a little crack grenade. Crack grenades are cool, so I thought it was actually kind of a cool little happy accident. And with that, I was really happy with him. Again, by comparison to the other figures, he's super generic, but he's kind of exactly what I would like to see in another Chaos kit. He's that happy medium that I'm looking for. He still looks chaosified, but he doesn't look entirely dedicated to one side, whether it be a specific god or a specific warband. It's just kind of that perfect medium ground that I'm looking for. I don't know, maybe it is just a detail creep thing. I do like having models that have less detail for me to fill in with my brush, so I think that's the basis of why I like these kinds of figures. But I digress, let's move on to the next guy. Now we're going to be tackling the leader, and like I stated previously, I did kind of go AWOL with the long arms. Though it doesn't exactly look too long. It's kind of that, actually these are pretty good. Can you tell that I record this while watching the footage back? I just kind of narrate it like a wrestling commentator. But anyway, I actually don't think the arms are too long on the Corvus body. So my previous statement is moot, but I still said it and I don't have any energy to go back and delete it. But as one little extra testament to the Corvus bodies, I love the poses. Some are very hunched down, some stand up straight like this guy. I really like that. It really does diversify a squad. But beyond the obvious bits that I'm using from the regular Chaos kit, the backpack came from the older kit. Honestly, they look right at home on the Corvus armor. They're detailed, but they're not too detailed. In fact, in some ways it almost doesn't look chaosy because it doesn't have that much trim. But we'll fix that momentarily. Atop the backpack, I decided to use this Impaled Astartes skull from the 8-bound kit. If you were questioning which side these guys reside on, this should answer your question. God, that's a gnarly bit. I love it so much. I really do need to paint the 8-bound guys on stream or something. But with some posing, this is a great little addition, and again, really not that much chaos trim, but I don't think he needs it. But we're still gonna be giving him some chaos trim. Actually, he has the most chaos trim out of all the figures, as I decided to add on some of the pauldrons from the regular chaos kit. Figured of the squad, having the champion have the most trim seems to be the best idea that I could go with. Making him more of a chaos champion is something that I think works better. An undivided champion at that too. I really like how he looks. Just adding on this helmet from the regular kit just adds all the more extra flair to him. He looks mean, he looks evil, and he looks like he's about ready to pull you apart like string cheese. But as one final extra little bit, I decided to add on some green stuff. I ended up just placing a little blob on his torso, or his pelvis, or his crotch, whatever you want to say, and I started slicing down using my X-Acto knife. That's a horrible sentence I just said. But the idea is I just wanted to make a nice little fur pelt. It's an incredibly easy thing to create with green stuff, and as you guys probably know, I am very much a novice when it comes to green stuff, so this is something that really works for me. It's not that difficult, it's really simple, and it really does add a lot to a figure. Only thing you gotta worry about is adding in too many carves, as if you go too fast with it, you can end up tearing up the green stuff and you end up just having all of your progress undone. So it is just a matter of just knowing when to stop. But once I was happy with the tattered little fur pelt, I then decided to add on some grenades using one of the other little swatches from the Reaver's kit. I really love these little things. They add that little extra detail to a model, and I really like the more tactical feeling to the figures. And with that small addition, my Chaos Champion is ready for painting. And I really like this guy. The pose is awesome, he has more detail than the rest of the figures, which distinguishes him from the squad. And despite a lot of people seeming to hate the idea of Chaos Marines and Space Marines alike not wearing a helmet, I think it looks badass. This guy harnesses the power of the warp, who needs a helmet? That's for babies. But it's time for the final figure, the Sniper. To start things out, I used one of the Stalker bolters from the Deathwatch kit, and I'd slice off the Inquisition symbol. Reason the top portion of the arm is mangled is there was a pauldron I couldn't remove, so I ended up having to snip it off. For his melon, you'll probably recognize this is from the Push Fit kit, the guys that I built in the last episode. Figured since I had all these extra bits lying around, I'd implement them into the Chaos Marines. Man, I think it's really cool to have a sneakier looking Chaos Marine, or possibly a Chaotic Reaver. I suppose this would kind of be perfect for an Alpha Legion figure too. For his pauldrons, however, I decided to go with the older Chaos kit. Seemed fitting, but most of these are going to be covered up anyway. For his arm, I ended up using another Push-Fit Marine arm, and I ended up using the top portion of a Corvus arm. The Primaris arms are definitely too big for these figures, so snipping it down the middle was the way to go. After a good amount of sanding, I joined these two at the elbow. And it still is a little long, but with it tucked into his chest, this is where it actually makes sense. Previous analogy for the Chaos arms may not have made sense, but this actually does. Okay, this still looks really long, because most of the length is in the forearm, but it still looks cool, who cares. And we're adding in just another one of those chaotic pauldrons. I should have waited until these bits were fully adhered too. As you can see, every little movement basically jiggles it around like a Jenga tower. But once the arms were fully formed, we'd add on one of the regular old backpacks. But now it's time that we go even crazier with the green stuff. After mixing just a little bit with some milliput, I decided to sculpt on a cape, and I'm not exactly fully proud of this one. Hence why the footage is a little, I don't know, it's not great. I tried adhering it over the collar, and I'd adhere it over the pauldrons, kind of going exactly for what they go for on the regular snipers kits. But it's not my best work. I really think it was a matter of trying to get things in the right place, and I'd overcompensate by resculpting it over and over again. And at the end of the day, it doesn't look terrible. I'm just not super duper happy with it. Though with the primer applied, it doesn't look terrible. I think this is one of those things that can be salvaged if I know what I'm doing with my brush. Though in kind of a roundabout way of trying to plug what I have in mind for the future of the channel, I think this kind of misshapen sculpt will be good practice for when I paint some metal figures on the channel. I say it all the time, and I even said it once in this episode, but I like filling in the detail with my brush, so this will be a challenge. And I think it'll be a fun one. But overall, all 5 of these guys I'm really happy with. I actually ended up building an additional 3 figures, but they're very different from these guys, and you can look forward to that in another sequel. But hey, like I said, leave a comment on how I should paint these guys up. I'm pretty indecisive, so giving me some cool ideas would be really appreciated. But I've definitely been flapping my beak enough for one video. If you liked what you saw, remember, leave a like, comment, and subscribe, share it with a friend, and remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya!